Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, the information has just come out that Letecia Stauch has been cleared for trial. She's passed her second competency test, and that means that the hurdles that were in the way of delaying the trial have now been sort of swept away, and so the Stauch case is now going to trial quite soon this year. Just to recap, the Stauch murder of little 11-year-old Ganon Stauch happened on the 27th of January 2020. Investigators are of the opinion that Letecia moved Ganon's body through the house into the garage, and you've kind of got to know the layout of the house to appreciate what is going on. Actually, it was from the basement area. That was where Ganon's room was, and then loaded it into the back of her Tiguan, her Volkswagen Tiguan. Then there was also her daughter, a 17-year-old, who she asked to buy carpet cleaner, trash bags, vinegar, baking soda. This is according to the affidavit. And I don't think that her daughter knew what she was doing or knew what it was for, but she was, to some extent, I don't want to even say an accessory, but she was assisting her mother, but I guess unknowingly, right? And it appears so because her daughter hasn't been charged with anything, and her daughter is likely going to be a witness in a trial, which I think is going to be some of the most riveting testimony, is what her daughter says. And I'm not sure whether Ganon's other sibling is going to testify. That's difficult to say because of her age, but investigators theorized that Letecia cleaned up the evidence and then called 911 at 6:55 p.m. In the evening to say that Ganon hadn't returned home and that he was playing with friends. A little bit of a similar situation to the Chris Watts case, where it was like Shanann and the children were at a friend's house kind of thing, but then you couldn't say who that friend was. Well, the same thing here. And bear in mind that this disappearance, quote unquote disappearance, happened after the Chris Watts case. So one wonders whether Letecia was looking at the Watts case and wondering, well, I can do better than that, or there's an idea kind of thing. It's a very peculiar case. I did write a book on it called Boy Interrupted. You can check it out. But what is interesting with Letecia is the aftermath, the assaulting of a prison guard, I think, and I think she was in hospital briefly with wounds sustained when she tried to escape. But what is interesting is she changed her story from the original version, saying that she'd actually been held at gunpoint and raped by a man who had abducted Ganon. So this was like a huge, wild departure on her original version of events. Of course, investigators couldn't find any evidence to support that. So there was no sign of rape. There was no sign of any of the things that she was talking about there. So just to recap the timeline, on January the 27th, Ganon was reported missing by his stepmother. So Ganon wasn't Letecia's biological offspring, although she did have a daughter that was hers. And her story was that Ganon had left home but somewhere between 3:15 in the afternoon and 4. And then he'd walked to a friend's house in Colorado Springs. And so the initial press release described him as, it was like a juvenile runaway, that he'd run away from home. And so initially they were looking for much the same as the Madeleine McCann case. They were looking for a living boy. They're looking for a child sort of in line of sight, where is Ganon, and Ganon, if you can hear this message, please come home, kind of thing. And of course, looking for a living person is completely different to looking for someone who's no longer living. when you look for someone who's no longer living, you would be using cadaver dogs, ground penetrating radar, dive teams, excavations, all that kind of thing. You'd be looking in dumpsters and drums, and it's just a totally different way that you look for someone who you suspect is deceased compared to someone who's living. Then on January the 30th, 3 days later, Gannon's disappearance was reclassified as a missing endangered person, so no longer a runaway. So this was taking it up a bar, and of course that wasn't really accurate either. And so you had the sheriff's office asking for information for people to call authorities, and they were kind of upset at this stage already about misinformation on social media about the case. They didn't say what the misinformation was, but we saw how Letecia Stauch herself went onto social media to give her versions of events, and also gave her version of Chris Watts' Sermon on the Porch. She sort of gave a sermon on the verge where she just set her story, well, not set her story straight, but basically gave her story to the media. And when you look at the timeline, and that, you know, in terms of how I researched everything, it's very interesting looking at the timeline of that interview and what she did immediately afterwards, where she went immediately afterwards, what she did with Gannon's body immediately after that interview. Then on February the 3rd, Letecia Stauch responded to online comments, and that was the day that it happened. It was with the CBS affiliate KKTV, and she said, "I took care of Gannon for the last 2 years in our home." She said, "I would never, ever hurt this child." Do you remember what Patsy Ramsey said? Was, "I loved that child." So there's kind of distancing language there.
I would never, ever hurt this child. And I know there's some questions out there.
Letecia then went on to say, "I know there are some questions out there. That's up to the investigations when they end up letting you guys know, but I've cooperated with them." And I don't know if that is true. There was definitely something going on besides Letecia cooperating with the police. You know, the narrative just surrounding the various vehicles that she hired and where they went shows the level of subterfuge that was involved, which I think is quite interesting. She also told KKTV, "We are going to find Gannon, and that's the main goal that we all have. I'm just ready for Gannon to come home." And that's also something Chris Watts said, you know, "I just want them to come home." Once again, there wasn't really any grief. There wasn't any real concern for Gannon. It seemed to be more about, she was concerned about how she appeared to other people and what other people were saying, right? And of course, at this time, there was a massive search effort to find Gannon. There were death threats that were coming out, according to Letecia, which I'm not sure if you believe that the family would receive death threats, but looks like she would want to conflate the death threats with what she perhaps knew had happened to Gannon, I guess. I mean, that's one possible explanation. Of course, it's innocent until proven guilty. She hasn't actually been tried in court, but the case against her does seem to be pretty strong. So anyway, what followed this television appearance were massive search efforts using aerial drone footage, rescue canines. The FBI child abduction rapid deployment got involved, the Colorado Springs Police Department, of course, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Then on February 4th, a neighbor came forward with surveillance footage. This was another parallel to the Watts case. Once again, the surveillance footage was a little bit questionable, and a little bit unclear. You were seeing things and not seeing things, and you didn't really know what that meant. And when I wrote Boy Interrupted, I really went into that aspect where you think, when you're looking at CCTV footage, that seeing is believing, and that this footage is absolutely kind of black and white, but it's not. It's digital footage and it's not always clear. Sometimes digital equipment doesn't pick up certain things. But it did show Letecia Stauch leaving the house with Gannon and returning hours later, apparently alone. And I don't think that is true. I think she did return with Gannon. You just don't see it very clearly in the footage. So I don't know if this report is accurate. Then it refers to the neighbor Roderick Drayton telling ABC News, and this is from an ABC News article, that he just decided to go through his footage once the search intensified. And he saw Letecia getting into a red pickup truck Monday morning at 10:13 a.m. and so on and so on. I'll put a link to this timeline in the description so you can see, just kind of get a bit of a review of the case. She returns in the truck at 2:19, but Gannon's nowhere to be seen. But actually, he very likely did return with her. And of course, following all of this, there was a heck of a lot of searching, and eventually culminating in Letecia's arrest on March the 2nd. She was held without bond, and this was even before his body still had not been found at that point. And then Letecia made an appearance in Colorado on March the 11th, and at that time she was in South Carolina, of all places. And then she didn't speak during that appearance, and then around about a week after that, and close to 2 months after Gannon's disappearance, authorities were saying that they'd found a body in Pace, Florida, near the Escambia River Bridge. So, a long way from Colorado Springs, and also a long way from South Carolina, where Letecia was at the time of her arrest. And so there wasn't a lot of detail about what led to the discovery, but they were asking for people, again, to come forward with, did you see anything? Did you see someone running around the highway, kind of thing? And I put up a couple of videos about the discovery of the body then, around March 20th. And obviously this discovery led to the District Attorney's Office filing additional charges, in fact 9 additional charges against Gannon's stepmother. And these included a count of first-degree murder after deliberation, so in other words, premeditated murder, and then 8 counts of committing a crime of violence. Through the course of all of this, a affidavit was leaked by a paralegal. As far as I'm aware, I think she was actually charged not that long ago, but she took a plea deal. And I was able to write a book, Boy Interrupted, based to a large extent on that affidavit and also the media reports, and then just using the information there to put together certainly a narrative of what had likely happened. So the court case has been slated for March, the middle of March, specifically the 11th and 12th. And the prosecution will present evidence, and they will decide whether there's enough. It's essentially a preliminary hearing, but they'll decide whether there's enough for the case to go to trial. And so we all look forward to that, to the wheels of justice starting to turn in this particular case. So we'll be counting down the days to that hearing and then to the trial itself. Just a final note that there won't be an episode on the JonBenet Ramsey case today. There will be one tomorrow dealing with the fascinating artifact in that case, which is the implement used in what is called the garrote. I don't even think it should be called a garrote, but the wooden implement, which was one of Patsy's paintbrushes. We're going to look at that in a lot of detail. We're going to be looking at images, and so that promises to be quite an interesting episode. Check that out tomorrow in the series on JonBenet Ramsey. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.